Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Richmond, Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The case we examine today has remained buried in Richmond's historical archives for over a century. What transpired at the Thornfield estate in 1837 speaks to the darkest capabilities of human nature when power, wealth, and moral corruption intersect. As you listen to this account, remember that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary people who commit unspeakable acts behind closed doors. The summer of 1837 was unusually warm in Richmond, Virginia. The heat hung heavy in the air, oppressive and unrelenting, much like the economic crisis gripping the nation. Plantation owners gathered at elaborate social events, desperately displaying their wealth and status, while the panic of 1837 threatened to unravel the very fabric of Southern aristocracy. Among Richmond's elite was Edmund Thornfield, a tobacco planter whose family name had been synonymous with Virginia aristocracy since the early 1700s. His estate, Thornwood, sat approximately 7 miles northwest of Richmond Center along the winding James River, accessible via a long, oak-lined drive that local stagecoach drivers described as unnaturally quiet, even in daylight. The plantation house stood 3 stories tall with its imposing Georgian columns and meticulously manicured gardens, a testament to the Thornfield family's prosperity and position. Yet beneath this impressive facade lay a foundation crumbling under the weight of mounting debt and moral decay. Edmund's wife, Margaret, had passed 5 years prior due to what physicians recorded as a wasting illness of uncertain origin, though household staff later suggested her decline began shortly after discovering certain private correspondences in her husband's study. Her death left Edmund with their only daughter, Eleanor, a refined young woman of 20 years with chestnut hair and her mother's perceptive hazel eyes. Eleanor possessed a gentle disposition and was known throughout Richmond society for her musical talents and charitable nature. She frequently volunteered at St. Paul's Church, teaching piano to less fortunate young women, an activity that, according to church records, her father increasingly restricted as 1837 progressed. Eleanor had recently become engaged to Thomas Harrington, son of a prominent banking family from Philadelphia. The match appeared perfect on paper, old Southern land wealth uniting with Northern banking prosperity. However, surviving letters between Edmund and his financial advisor revealed that the match promised something far more urgent than mere social advancement. It represented financial salvation for the increasingly desperate Edmund Thornfield. The first signs that something was amiss at Thornwood appeared in the ledgers of the First Bank of Richmond. According to records examined years later by financial historian Dr. James Whitcomb, Edmund had mortgaged his property 3 times over, with payments increasingly falling behind. The bank's internal memoranda, preserved in their archives until 1964, documented growing concern about Thornfield's ability to meet his obligations. One note from bank president William Rathbone, dated February 1837, stated, "Mr. Thornfield's latest proposal cannot be entertained. While the Thornfield name carries considerable weight, the bank cannot accept further promises without tangible security. His request for additional funds based on projected tobacco yields appears increasingly desperate." Letters exchanged between Edmund and his creditors revealed increasingly frantic pleas for extensions. In one particularly revealing letter to merchant Henry Clayton, dated March 1837, Edmund wrote, "I beseech you to extend our arrangement until after the summer harvest. The Thornfield name has never been associated with default, and I intend to maintain that tradition. Several promising ventures will soon bear fruit, and my daughter's advantageous match will secure our position. I merely require time." Clayton's annotation on this letter, discovered among his business papers in 1952, simply stated, "Thornfield's situation appears dire." Consider writing off the debt rather than throwing good money after bad. The economic panic of 1837 had devastated many planters, but Edmund's financial troubles predated the crisis, stemming from years of gambling and increasingly risky investments in ventures ranging from canal projects to speculative land deals in the Western Territories. A gambling ledger from the Westmoreland Club in Richmond, where Virginia's elite gentlemen gathered for cards and political discourse, showed Edmund's losses mounting steadily between 1833 and 1837. By spring of that fateful year, he had been quietly asked to settle his accounts before returning to the establishment. A humiliating exclusion from one of Richmond society's most important institutions. A visitor to Thornwood in early June 1837 noted in his private correspondence that, despite the grand facade, the estate showed subtle signs of neglect. Paint peeled discreetly from window frames, and fewer servants attended the family. Several fields lay fallow, a stark contrast to the plantation's former productivity. The visitor, James Whitaker, a business associate from Baltimore, recorded his impressions of dinner at Thornwood. Mr. Thornfield maintains all appearances of prosperity, yet there is a tension that hangs in the air like Virginia's summer humidity. Conversations halt abruptly when certain topics approach. The silver, while prominently displayed, shows signs of hasty polishing. His daughter plays the pianoforte beautifully, but her eyes seem distant, as though her mind wanders to troubling thoughts. Most curious was the arrival of a Mr. Caldwell during our brandy, a man of considerable age and unsettling demeanor, with whom Mr. Thornfield spoke privately for some duration. Whitaker's observations, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives until 1965, provide one of the few contemporaneous accounts of the Thornfield household before the events that would later unfold. His letter continues, "What struck me most was how Eleanor's demeanor changed upon Caldwell's arrival. She grew pale and silent, excusing herself shortly thereafter. I inquired about the gentleman, but Edmund merely stated he was a business associate from New Orleans with interests in the tobacco trade. The man's gaze followed Eleanor until she left the room, with an expression I can only describe as proprietary. Sebastian Caldwell, according to port records from New Orleans, was indeed a businessman of sorts. His name appears on manifests of ships engaged in both legitimate and questionable commerce throughout the Caribbean. While his official trade was in luxury goods and tobacco, rumors connected him to less reputable ventures. A report from a New Orleans customs official dated 1835 noted Caldwell's shipments warrant careful inspection. Though documentation appears in order, his associates have connections to known smuggling operations. The gentleman himself maintains an impeccable public reputation, though his private activities invite speculation. The nature of his relationship with Edmund Thornfield remains subject to speculation, though bank records indicate several substantial transfers from Caldwell to Thornfield in the months preceding June 1837. Caldwell's presence in Virginia society was limited but notable. The Richmond Enquirer mentioned his attendance at Governor's Ball in May 1837, describing him as a distinguished visitor from New Orleans, whose interests in Virginia's agricultural bounty have brought him to our fair state. Those who encountered him described a man of approximately 60 years, impeccably dressed in the finest European fashions, with unnervingly steady gray eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything and everyone they beheld. He maintained a suite at Richmond's finest hotel, though staff later recalled he spent little time there, often returning in the early hours of morning smelling of expensive cigars and bourbon. By mid-June, Eleanor's wedding preparations were underway. Dressmakers' receipts and correspondence with the St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond confirm arrangements for an August ceremony. Eleanor wrote to her childhood friend, Catherine Pembroke, "The wedding plans progress, though Father seems strangely hurried about the matter. Thomas arrives next week from Philadelphia, and I confess to some apprehension. Father has changed these past months. The warmth that once characterized him, even after Mother's passing, has given way to a cold pragmatism I scarcely recognize. He locks himself in his study most evenings, and I hear raised voices when Mr. Caldwell visits. Yesterday I overheard mention of a contractual obligation that must be fulfilled before summer's end. I cannot help but wonder if it relates to our plantation's finances, which I fear are not as sound as Father pretends. This letter, discovered in Catherine Pembroke's personal effects after her death in 1889, represents the last known communication from Eleanor before the events that would follow. What makes it particularly chilling is the postscript, added in a hastier hand. Mr. Caldwell watched me from across the garden today. The way his eyes followed me made my skin crawl. Father insists I be cordial to him, as he is an important business associate. I cannot explain the sense of dread that overcomes me in his presence. Last night I woke to find someone had entered my room while I slept. Nothing was taken, but my hairbrush had been moved, and I found one of my ribbons missing. I have taken to barring my door, though Father chided me for such unnecessary precaution. I count the days until Thomas arrives. The arrival of Thomas Harrington on June 22nd is documented in the register of the Exchange Hotel in Richmond. He sent a message to Thornwood announcing his arrival and intention to call upon his fiancée the following day. According to the hotel staff's later statements to Judge William Cartwright, Thomas appeared in high spirits, requesting their finest champagne be sent to his room to celebrate his upcoming nuptials. The hotel manager recalled Thomas speaking enthusiastically about his plans to bring Eleanor to Philadelphia after the wedding, where he had purchased a handsome townhouse near Rittenhouse Square. What happened next is pieced together from multiple sources. Thomas's own account given to authorities, statements from Thornwood's house servants, and documentation discovered years later in Edmund Thornfield's private papers. On the morning of June 23rd, Thomas arrived at Thornwood expecting a joyful reunion with his betrothed. Instead, he was informed by Edmund that Eleanor had fallen gravely ill with a sudden fever and could not receive visitors. Edmund appeared disheveled, according to Thomas's account, with the look of a man who had not slept properly in days, though he maintained a facade of control. Concerned, Thomas offered to summon a physician from Richmond, but Edmund assured him that the plantation's doctor was already attending to her. For 3 days, Thomas called at Thornwood, only to be turned away with varying excuses. The servant's demeanor struck him as increasingly evasive. On the 4th day, growing increasingly suspicious, he arrived unannounced in the early morning hours, hoping to speak with the servants before Edmund awoke. It was then that Sarah, Eleanor's personal maid for many years, revealed the disturbing truth. Eleanor was not ill but had been confined to her rooms. Sarah reported hearing arguments between father and daughter, followed by the sound of a key turning in the lock. Most alarming was Sarah's claim that she had observed Mr. Caldwell entering Eleanor's room with Edmund late at night, carrying papers that required her signature. Miss Eleanor was crying, Sarah whispered to Thomas in the kitchen, constantly glancing toward the stairs. She refused to sign something, and then Mr. Thornfield said she would remain in her rooms until she accepted reality. They took her meals up, but she barely touches them. I've never seen the master like this, so cold, like he's made a calculation, and nothing will sway him. Thomas immediately demanded to see Eleanor, but was intercepted by Edmund in the main hall of Thornwood. The confrontation, witnessed by several servants, escalated quickly. Thomas accused Edmund of holding Eleanor against her will, to which Edmund responded with icy composure. According to multiple accounts, Edmund ordered Thomas off the property, threatening violence if he returned. When Thomas demanded explanation, Edmund's response was chilling in its calculation. My daughter has reconsidered the engagement. She has made a more advantageous match, one that better serves her future and the Thornfield legacy. Your services as a suitor are no longer required. When Thomas insisted on hearing this directly from Eleanor, Edmund reportedly placed his hand on the pistol he carried and stated, "You are trespassing on my property, Mr. Harrington." Virginia law grants me considerable latitude in how I might respond to such an intrusion. I suggest you return to Philadelphia immediately. There is nothing for you here." The butler, James Wilson, would later testify that he had never heard his employer speak in such a menacing tone during his 15 years of service. Rushing back to Richmond, Thomas sought the assistance of the city sheriff, presenting his concerns about Eleanor's welfare. The sheriff, however, was reluctant to interfere in what he deemed a domestic matter between a father and his unmarried daughter. Records from the sheriff's office note the complaint, but indicate no immediate action was taken, citing Eleanor's legal status as under her father's authority. The sheriff's deputy wrote, "Mr. Harrington appears genuinely concerned but cannot provide evidence of actual wrongdoing. Mr. D. Thornfield is within his rights to restrict his daughter's visitors and manage her affairs until marriage." Desperate, Thomas turned to Eleanor's maternal uncle, Judge William Cartwright, who still maintained connections in Richmond despite having moved to Williamsburg years earlier. The judge's journals, preserved in the College of William and Mary archives, detail his concern upon receiving Thomas's urgent message. "I received most disturbing news concerning my niece. While Edmund and I have maintained only formal relations since Margaret's passing, I cannot ignore such troubling allegations. Though a father's authority over an unmarried daughter is considerable under our laws, the suggestion of coercion and confinement demands investigation. I shall depart for Richmond at first light." Judge Cartwright arrived at Thornwood on June 30th, using his legal authority to demand entry when servants initially denied him access. What he discovered would later be documented in a private memorandum to the governor of Virginia. Eleanor was indeed being held in her chambers against her will. The once vibrant young woman appeared haggard and withdrawn. The room, while physically comfortable, had been converted to a gentle prison, the windows nailed shut and the door locked from the outside. More disturbingly, he found evidence of a marriage contract between Eleanor and Sebastian Caldwell, bearing what appeared to be her signature, though Judge Cartwright would later contest its authenticity based on comparison with her previous correspondence. The confrontation between Judge Cartwright and Edmund Thornfield occurred in the main study of Thornwood. According to the judge's account, "I found my brother-in-law in a state of agitation, but not remorse. When confronted with his actions, he spoke of financial necessities and family obligations with cold pragmatism. 'What would you have me do?' he demanded, pouring himself bourbon despite the early hour. 'Watch our family name sink into obscurity? The Philadelphia connection brings prestige but insufficient capital for our immediate needs. Caldwell's offer solves everything. The plantation remains, debts are settled, and Eleanor will want for nothing as his wife.' When I suggested this was nothing short of selling his own daughter, his expression remained unmoved. 'We all pay our debts one way or another,' was his only response." The judge's journal entry continues, "What disturbed me most was not Edmund's desperation, which I had suspected for some time, but the complete absence of paternal feeling. He spoke of Eleanor as one might discuss a particularly valuable breeding horse, an asset whose primary worth lay in what it could secure for the estate. When I reminded him of his duty to protect his daughter, he laughed bitterly. 'Protection requires resources, William. The world respects the Thornfield name because of our land, our position. Without that, what protection could I offer her? Caldwell is wealthy, established. She will adapt to the arrangement, as women have done throughout history.' Judge Cartwright immediately removed Eleanor from Thornwood, bringing her to his Williamsburg home. Eleanor's physical state upon arrival was documented by Dr. Samuel Prescott, the family physician. The young woman appears physically unharmed, but exhibits signs of severe nervous distress. She startles at sudden movements and refuses to sleep without a lamp burning. Most concerning is her fear of being alone in closed rooms, suggesting recent trauma associated with confinement. I have prescribed mild sedatives to assist with sleep, though I believe time and security will prove more effective remedies than any medical intervention. The legal battle that followed would reveal the full extent of Edmund's arrangements with Caldwell. Court records indicate that in exchange for clearing Edmund's substantial debts, which by then exceeded $75,000, an enormous sum for the time, and providing additional funds to maintain Thornwood, Caldwell had purchased the right to marry Eleanor. The contract, drawn up to appear legitimate, included clauses giving Caldwell control of Eleanor's inheritance from her mother's family and any future claims to Thornfield property. Most disturbing was a section specifying that Eleanor would relocate to Caldwell's estate near New Orleans immediately following a private ceremony, effectively removing her from her Virginia connections and support network. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how Edmund manipulated legal systems designed to protect property rights to essentially sell his daughter. The contract was worded carefully to avoid explicit language of human trafficking, instead framing it as a marriage alliance with financial considerations, a common enough practice among elite families, though rarely so nakedly transactional. Judge Cartwright noted in his private papers, "The document is masterfully crafted to appear as a standard marriage contract with attendant financial arrangements. Only when one understands the circumstances, Eleanor's confinement, the absence of consent, Caldwell's age and character, does the true nature of the transaction become clear." Eleanor's own statement, preserved in the court records, offers a glimpse into the psychological torment she endured. When Father first suggested Mr. Caldwell as a suitor, I thought it merely a jest in poor taste, as the gentleman is nearly 40 years my senior. When I realized he was serious, I expressed my firm commitment to Thomas. Father's response was not anger, but disappointment, as though I had failed to understand a simple business transaction. He explained that our family's position, our very survival, depended on my cooperation. Her statement continues, "When persuasion failed, he resorted to confinement. My windows were nailed shut while I slept. My door was locked from the outside. My letters to Thomas and others were intercepted. I was told I would remain thus until I came to my senses. Mr. Caldwell would visit my rooms, speaking of our future together, while examining me as one might inspect livestock before purchase. I cannot describe the revulsion I felt as his eyes assessed me. During one such visit, he brought a jeweler to measure my fingers for rings. When I refused to extend my hand, Father held my wrist while measurements were taken. Through it all, Father stood by, encouraging me to be pleasant to my future husband." Perhaps most chilling was Eleanor's description of how the contract was signed. "After a week of confinement, I was weak from refusing food. Father came with Mr. Caldwell and a notary late at night. They placed the contract before me, along with a pen and ink. When I refused, Father reminded me that under Virginia law I could be declared incompetent, and he could sign on my behalf as my guardian, but that such an outcome would unnecessarily complicate matters and possibly reflect poorly on Mr. Caldwell's future wife. The implication that I might be institutionalized if I continued to resist was clear. With no apparent alternative, I signed the document, though I intentionally blotted the page with tears, hoping this might somehow invalidate what I was being forced to do. Sebastian Caldwell did not accept the dissolution of his contract quietly. Letters discovered in Edmund's study revealed Caldwell's threats following Eleanor's removal from Thornwood. "You have failed to deliver what was promised. The considerable sum advanced was predicated on our agreement. If satisfaction is not received, I shall be forced to seek alternative compensation, including certain revelations about your other business ventures, which I'm certain you would prefer remain private. A man in my position has connections throughout the southern states and territories that could make your continued residence in Virginia untenable." These other business ventures were alluded to in ledgers discovered hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards of Edmund's study. The documents suggested involvement in activities far beyond the legitimate tobacco trade, including what appeared to be investments in illegal slave trading operations after the 1808 federal ban. Several entries referenced shipments from West Africa to Cuba, with subsequent distribution to territories not yet under U.S. jurisdiction, circumventing federal law. This discovery would later explain Edmund's desperate need for Caldwell's money and connections. He was not just in debt, but potentially facing criminal charges if his activities came to light. Caldwell's letters grew increasingly menacing through July and August 1837. In one particularly disturbing message dated August 3rd, he wrote, "I have invested considerable resources in securing what was promised. My patience wears thin. Should legal remedies prove insufficient, there are other methods of obtaining satisfaction. Your daughter cannot remain under the judge's protection indefinitely. Consider carefully the consequences of your failure to honor our arrangement." This threat prompted Judge Cartwright to request additional security at his Williamsburg home. His personal diary notes, "I have hired 2 men of reliable character to maintain watch over the property. Eleanor does not leave the grounds without escort. The windows are checked nightly. I fear Caldwell's resources and determination make him dangerous. What kind of man pursues a woman who has explicitly rejected him, unless his interest is not in her person, but in the power her possession represents?" The legal proceedings were abruptly halted in September 1837 when Edmund Thornfield was found dead in his study at Thornwood. The estate's overseer discovered the body after Edmund failed to appear for breakfast. The official cause was listed as apoplexy, though rumors of suicide circulated through Richmond society. The coroner's report noted an empty bottle of laudanum nearby, but reached no definitive conclusion of self-destruction. The Richmond Enquirer's brief obituary made no mention of the recent scandal, stating only that Edmund Thornfield, a longtime pillar of Virginia society, had passed suddenly at his estate and would be remembered for his contributions to the Commonwealth's agricultural prosperity. A more revealing account comes from Reverend Thomas Blackwell, who was called to the scene before authorities arrived. His private correspondence with a seminary colleague, uncovered in church archives in 1959, described the scene. "I found Mr. Thornfield at his desk, papers scattered about as though he had been working frantically before his demise. Most striking was the expression frozen on his features, not peace nor pain, but a terrible resignation, as though he had finally recognized the full weight of his actions." A letter lay half-finished before him, addressed to his daughter, containing only the words, "Eleanor, you must understand that I had no choice but to," before trailing off unfinished. Whatever justification or perhaps apology he intended has gone with him to the grave. Sebastian Caldwell disappeared shortly thereafter. Port records indicate a departure from Norfolk to Havana on September 12th, though his subsequent movements remain untraced. Some accounts suggest he re-established his operations in Cuba, while others claim sightings along the Mississippi Delta. The Charleston Courier published a small notice in 1842 reporting the death of a man matching Caldwell's description following a dispute at a gaming house, but confirmation of this being the same individual has never been established. A New Orleans business directory from 1845 lists an import company under the name S. Caldwell and Associates, though whether this represented the same man or perhaps a relative remains uncertain. For Eleanor, the ordeal left permanent scars. She broke her engagement to Thomas Harrington, unable to proceed with any marriage plans after her experience. In a letter to Thomas dated October 1837, she wrote, "While my affection for you remains unchanged, I find myself altered in ways I cannot fully express. The thought of entering any marriage, even one of my choosing, now fills me with unspeakable dread. The transaction father arranged has tainted my understanding of what such unions represent. I need time to reclaim myself from being viewed as property to be transferred between men. I release you from any obligation and wish you every happiness, though I cannot be the source of it." Thomas's response, preserved among Eleanor's papers, was one of understanding and sorrow, though he maintained correspondence with her for several years thereafter. Judge Cartwright's household accounts show payments to physicians specializing in nervous disorders. A notation from December 1837 reads, Dr. Merriweather attended Eleanor again today. Her night terrors continue, though less severely. She still cannot bear to have her bedroom door closed and insists on a lamp burning through the night. When I suggested a brief carriage ride to town, the very thought of venturing beyond our gates provoked such anxiety that I immediately withdrew the proposal. I fear Caldwell's threats have created a prison in her mind more confining than the locked room at Thornwood. Dr. Merriweather's notes, discovered among his papers after his death in 1860, provide clinical observations of Eleanor's condition. The patient exhibits classic symptoms of nervous exhaustion following severe emotional trauma. Physical symptoms include disrupted sleep, loss of appetite, and trembling when discussing certain topics. Most concerning is her persistent fear that she remains property to be claimed. She reports dreams in which she is locked in a trunk being transported to New Orleans, unable to breathe or cry out. I have prescribed valerian root for sleep and recommended daily walks in the garden, accompanied by trusted companions. Progress is slow, but discernible. Eleanor eventually relocated to Boston in 1840, where her mother's cousins provided a fresh start, away from the whispers of Richmond society. A letter to Judge Cartwright explains her decision. "Virginia holds too many shadows, Uncle. Each familiar sight becomes a reminder. In Boston, I might fashion a life defined by something other than what was nearly taken from me. Mother's cousins have shown great kindness, and the distance from Richmond society's curiosity offers its own form of medicine. I shall never forget your intervention, which quite literally saved me from a fate I still cannot bear to contemplate fully." Records from the Massachusetts Historical Society indicate she became involved in early advocacy for women's legal rights, particularly regarding marriage and property laws. An 1845 petition to the Massachusetts legislature bears her signature, along with those of several prominent Boston women advocating for married women's property rights. Though she never married, Eleanor established a small school for young women that emphasized financial literacy and independence, perhaps the most telling response to her own experience of being treated as a tradable asset by the man who should have been her protector. An advertisement for Miss Thornfield's Academy for Young Ladies in the Boston Evening Transcript from 1847 describes the unusual curriculum. In addition to traditional accomplishments, pupils will receive instruction in financial management, property law, and professional skills suitable for respectable employment. Miss Thornfield believes young women must be equipped for independence in an uncertain world. This progressive approach attracted the daughters of Boston's more liberal families, including several early suffragists who would later credit Eleanor's teachings with shaping their views on women's economic rights. Thornwood Plantation was sold to cover Edmund's debts, passing through several owners before being largely abandoned during the Civil War. The house itself burned in 1863 during a Union advance through the area. A Union officer's letter home described the property. "We encountered a once grand estate, already half reclaimed by nature, its gardens overgrown and fields untended. The locals refer to it with obvious discomfort, relating a sordid tale of debt and betrayal. The place has an unwholesome atmosphere even before we put it to the torch, as though the very walls had absorbed some moral corruption from those who once inhabited them. Today only the stone foundation and some scattered outbuilding remains mark where the grand estate once stood. Local residents reported an aversion to the ruins well into the 20th century, describing an unexplainable sense of heaviness that seemed to linger over the property. A local historian interviewed in 1952 noted that despite the land's fertility, several attempts to establish new farms or residences on the property had failed, with owners complaining of unexplainable discomfort and an atmosphere of calculation and despair that seems embedded in the very soil. In 1965, during construction of a housing development near the original Thornwood site, workers uncovered a sealed box within the remains of the estate's cornerstone. Inside were additional Thornfield family papers that had escaped the fire, including Edmund's private journal covering the years 1835-1837. The contents were donated to the Virginia Historical Society, but were restricted from public access until 2000, at the request of remaining Thornfield descendants who feared the revelations might tarnish the family name even generations later. The journal entries from the spring and summer of 1837 reveal a man consumed not by love for his daughter, but by desperate calculation. Edmund wrote in April, "Another disappointing meeting with Rathbone at the bank. The vultures circle ever closer. Without immediate capital infusion, Thornwood will be lost within months. The Harrington boy brings good connections, but little immediate capital, and our situation cannot wait for future prospects." Caldwell's offer represents salvation, if only Eleanor would recognize the necessity. Her resistance stems from girlish romantic notions that have no place in the practical considerations of maintaining our position. A May entry reads, "Caldwell increased his offer today. The sum would clear all debts and leave sufficient reserves to restore Thornwood to its former glory. He desires not just a wife, but a connection to established Virginia society. I am selling him respectability, and he is providing financial salvation. A fair exchange, by any measure." Eleanor fails to understand that this is not merely about comfort, but survival. Generations of Thornfields have made difficult choices to preserve our position. This is merely another such decision. Most disturbing was his entry from the night before he confined Eleanor to her rooms. I explained the situation plainly, appealing to her sense of family duty. I thought she possessed her mother's practicality beneath that romantic exterior. Instead, she became hysterical, threatening to expose our financial situation to the Harringtons and flee to Philadelphia. Such ingratitude cannot be tolerated. Until she accepts the necessity of this arrangement, she must be prevented from further foolishness. Caldwell grows impatient, and we cannot afford to lose his offer. The staff will be told she has taken ill with a fever. A physician's discretion is easily purchased. A particularly chilling entry from July records, "Caldwell visited Eleanor again today. His manner of examining her continues to unsettle even me, though I remind myself of the necessity driving our arrangement. He speaks of her as one might discuss a painting or statue he intends to acquire, focusing particularly on her resemblance to Margaret in her youth. I find I must drink more heavily during these visits. A curious weakness, considering what is at stake. Margaret would never forgive this transaction, but Margaret is not here to see our name and legacy crumbling. The living must make accommodations the dead are spared from considering." The last entry, dated the day before Edmund's death, consists of just 2 lines. "Caldwell's final threat arrived today. He will expose everything if the contract is not honored. All is lost. I have failed to uphold the Thornfield name where generations before me succeeded. May God have mercy." A separate sheet found folded within the journal contained calculations, debts, assets, and projected outcomes. Most disturbing was a simple notation, E.T. value to Caldwell, $85,000. The sum represented the combined value of Eleanor's person, her potential claim to her mother's family property in Williamsburg, and the social connections her bloodline represented. Edmund had literally calculated his daughter's worth as a commodity and found it sufficient to save Thornwood. Eleanor's own final statement on the matter comes from a letter written to Catherine Pembroke in 1850, discovered among Catherine's correspondence by her great-granddaughter in 1915. "You ask if I have found peace since those dark days at Thornwood. Peace perhaps is too generous a word, but I have found purpose. Each young woman who leaves my school understanding her own worth beyond the calculations of fathers and husbands represents a small victory against the system that nearly consumed me." Her letter continues with a sobering observation. What happened at Thornwood was not unique in kind, merely in degree. How many daughters are traded through more genteel arrangements, their value measured in acres and connections rather than outright coin? The true horror of my experience was not that it was extraordinary, but that it merely revealed the naked truth behind society's veneer. Father simply made explicit what typically remains tactfully unspoken, that in our world, a woman's primary value lies in what alliances her marriage can secure for the men who control her. My school teaches young women to recognize this reality and, where possible, to create alternatives for themselves. The letter concludes, "You ask also about forgiveness. I have come to understand Father's desperation, if not condone his response to it. The system that shaped him valued the Thornfield name and land above the Thornfield daughter. He was as much trapped by these values as I was by that locked bedroom door. The difference is that I have found my way to a different understanding, while he died still believing in the calculations that destroyed us both. Perhaps that is punishment enough." The Thornfield case faded from public memory as the Civil War and its aftermath transformed Virginia society. The papers discovered in 1965 were examined by a small number of historians, but never widely publicized. A dissertation on the case was prepared at the University of Virginia in 1968 by doctoral candidate Elizabeth Remington, but withdrawn from publication after pressure from several prominent Richmond families who maintained connections to the Thornfield lineage through maternal lines. Remington's academic advisor noted in a private letter, "The discomfort this case still provokes, even 130 years later, speaks to how directly it challenges cherished narratives about antebellum Southern society. The naked commodification of an elite white woman by her own father represents precisely what the system claimed to protect against." The Thornfield papers were resealed by the Virginia Historical Society following the aborted dissertation, with access restricted to credentialed historians with specific research purposes. The official reason cited was preservation concerns, though some have suggested the continuing influence of families connected to the Thornfields played a role in limiting public exposure of the case. It wasn't until 2000 that the restrictions were finally lifted, allowing the full record to be examined by researchers. What remains is a sobering reminder of how completely power could be exercised within family structures of the era, how easily human bonds could be subordinated to financial considerations, all within the bounds of what society considered legal, if not entirely moral. The horror lies not in supernatural elements or graphic violence, but in the cold calculation with which a father recast his daughter as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Today, the housing development built over Thornwood's ruins continues to expand. Residents occasionally report unusual sensations when walking near the small, preserved section of the original foundation. Not dramatic haunting, but a subtle feeling of being watched, evaluated, measured. Perhaps it is merely the power of suggestion, knowing what transpired there. Or perhaps it is the echo of a warning, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are those who view human lives, even those they should cherish most, as assets to be liquidated when necessity demands. Visitors to the Virginia Historical Society who inquire about the Thornfield papers report that staff still handle the collection with noticeable discomfort. "There's something about those documents," one archivist reportedly commented in 1995. "You feel the calculation behind every word. It's like reading the thoughts of someone who looks human but doesn't quite think like one." The ledger where he calculated his daughter's value is particularly disturbing. We keep it in a separate acid-free container, though I can't explain why it seems important to isolate it from his other papers. Dr. Marion Shelby, a historian specializing in women's experiences in antebellum Virginia, wrote in her 2002 analysis of the Thornfield case, "What makes these documents uniquely disturbing is how they reveal the intersection of patriarchal authority and market capitalism in its most naked form. Edmund Thornfield's journal demonstrates not just a father's betrayal of his daughter, but an entire system's betrayal of its claimed values. While Southern society ostensibly prized the protection of white womanhood, the Thornfield case exposes how easily those protections dissolved when in conflict with property and status preservation. The case has attracted renewed scholarly interest in the decades since the archives were fully opened." Dr. Rachel Montgomery's 2008 study, Calculated Values, Gender and Economics in the Antebellum South, dedicates a full chapter to the Thornfield case, noting, Eleanor Thornfield's commodification occurred within a legal framework that already viewed women as transferable assets. What makes her case remarkable is not the underlying principles, but their explicit expression. Edmund Thornfield simply stated openly what the marriage market implied, that daughters were assets whose value should be maximized through advantageous transfers. The ultimate fate of Sebastian Caldwell, the man who attempted to purchase a bride through her father's desperation, remains unconfirmed. However, a mention in a New Orleans obituary from 1843 describes the death of a formerly prominent businessman who died alone and unmourned, his final years marked by paranoia, and claims that he was being watched by a young woman no one else could see. While the name differs slightly, Sebastian Calder rather than Caldwell, the timing and description have led some researchers to speculate this may have been the same man, perhaps living under a modified name following the scandal in Oscoda, Virginia. A journal purportedly belonging to this Sebastian Calder surfaced in a French Quarter antique shop in 1978. While its authenticity remains disputed, the final entries describe a man haunted by his actions. I see her watching me from corners, from behind curtains, from the shadows beside my bed, not as she was when I attempted to claim her, but as she might have aged had she been transported here as my possession. Her eyes hold no anger, only a terrible knowing, as though she sees through my flesh to the hollow space where a human feeling should reside. I have barred my doors, dismissed the servants, yet still she finds her way in. Last night she stood at the foot of my bed silent until dawn broke. I have not slept since. As for Eleanor Thornfield, her school in Boston operated until 1865, when her declining health forced its closure. She died in 1867 at age 50, never having returned to Virginia. Her modest gravestone in Mount Auburn Cemetery bears only her name and the dates of her birth and death, with a single additional line, "She reclaimed what was sold." No record explains the meaning of this epitaph, though those familiar with her story understand its significance all too well. An obituary in the Boston Evening Transcript praised her educational innovations and advocacy for women's financial independence. Miss Thornfield challenged conventional notions about female education, insisting that young women learn to protect themselves through knowledge of legal and financial matters traditionally reserved for men. Her students emerged not merely accomplished in feminine arts, but armed with practical understanding of property law and business principles. When questioned about her unorthodox curriculum, she would reply, "A woman cannot rely on others to value her correctly. She must know her own worth." Several of Eleanor's former students established a small scholarship in her name, which continues at Radcliffe College to this day. The endowment documentation includes a quote attributed to Eleanor that perhaps best summarizes the philosophy that emerged from her ordeal. Education is not merely ornamental, but essential armor against those who would define us by our utility to others rather than our inherent humanity. The Thornfield Academy's records, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, reveal Eleanor's determination to prevent other women from experiencing her fate. In addition to traditional subjects, students studied contract law, banking principles, and property management. An unusual component of the curriculum was what Eleanor called recognition exercises, training young women to identify coercion and manipulation in social interactions, particularly from male authority figures. One former student recalled, "Miss Thornfield taught us to hear what lay beneath pleasant words, to recognize when choices were being systematically removed, and to create financial resources that remained under our control, regardless of marital status." These lessons proved far more valuable than the ornamental accomplishments other schools emphasized. Eleanor never publicly discussed her experience at Thornwood, but her teaching philosophy clearly emerged from it. A school prospectus from 1855 states, "Young women must understand that their value exists independent of their utility to family ambitions or marital arrangements." This institution seeks to provide practical tools for maintaining that independence in a world that frequently challenges it. This radical approach attracted criticism from more traditional quarters, but earned devoted support from Boston's intellectual elite, including early women's rights advocates. Perhaps most poignant among the documents relating to the Thornfield case is a small leather-bound notebook discovered among Eleanor's possessions after her death. Unlike a traditional diary, it contains brief entries recording moments when she exercised choices denied her during her confinement. The first entry, dated shortly after her arrival in Boston, reads simply, "Today I locked my door from the inside and then unlocked it again 17 times. Because I could." Another states, "Declined an invitation to dine with the Hamiltons, not because they are unpleasant company, but because the choice was entirely mine to make." These small assertions of autonomy trace her gradual reclamation of self after being treated as property. The notebook's final entry, dated just weeks before her death, offers perhaps the most fitting conclusion to her story. "I have lived 30 years since Father decided my value could be measured in dollars. In that time, I have educated 173 young women to recognize their immeasurable worth. This, I believe, is the proper answer to his calculations." The papers that document this disturbing chapter of Richmond history were sealed again in 1968 after the aborted dissertation project, with access restricted to credentialed historians with specific research purposes. When finally made fully available in 2000, they attracted attention from scholars studying the legal and economic underpinnings of gender relations in antebellum America. Dr. William Forrester's 2010 analysis notes, "The Thornfield case represents a rare instance where the normally invisible becomes starkly visible. The commodification of women within marriage systems typically operated behind veils of sentimentality and social custom. Edmund Thornfield's mistake was not in treating his daughter as an asset, many fathers did so, but in failing to maintain the polite fiction that something more elevated was occurring. And so the story of the planter who sold his daughter faded once more into historical obscurity, remembered only by a few archivists and historians. Yet the uncomfortable questions it raises about power, ownership, and the commodification of human life, particularly women's lives, remain as relevant today as they were in 1837. Perhaps that is why, nearly 2 centuries later, the story still carries its quiet but persistent horror, not the shock of violence or supernatural terror, but the deeper, colder fear of recognizing how thin the line can be between protection and possession, between family and ownership. For those who walk the quiet streets of modern Richmond, particularly near the James River where Thornwood once stood, something of that history seems to linger in the air, not as a haunting, but as a memory etched into the landscape itself. A reminder that behind every grand historical facade often lies a darker truth, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear the voices that propriety and power once silenced. Historical researcher Marion Winters, who spent 6 months examining the Thornfield papers in 2005, described the experience. "Reading Edmund's journals feels like watching someone transform a person into an object through the power of calculation. The entries begin with at least nominal references to Eleanor as my daughter, but gradually shift to discussing her as the asset or the Thornfield offering. By the final entries, she exists primarily as a sum on a balance sheet. The horror isn't in what he did. History is unfortunately filled with fathers who sacrificed daughters to financial expediency. The horror is in witnessing, through his own words, the process by which he justified it to himself. The most terrifying aspect of the Thornfield case may be how easily it could have remained completely hidden. Had Judge Cartwright not intervened, had Thomas Harrington accepted Edmund's dismissal, Eleanor would have vanished into Caldwell's possession, her fate unrecorded except as a footnote in property transfers and marriage registers. How many similar stories were never interrupted, never documented, never preserved in historical archives? The silence surrounding those lost narratives may be the most disturbing legacy of all. A final note about the case comes from conservator Jessica Lindberg, who worked on preserving the Thornfield papers in 2013. Documents tell stories beyond their written content. Edmund's journal shows increasingly erratic handwriting as events progress. Ink blots, pressed quills that tear the paper, margins filled with repetitive calculations. The marriage contract with Caldwell bears a subtle water stain that forensic analysis suggests is consistent with tears falling onto the page. These physical traces speak volumes about the human cost behind the legal language and financial figures. They remind us that history's horrors often hide in ordinary documents, waiting for someone to really see them. In 2015, during renovations to the housing development near the original Thornwood site, construction workers uncovered a small tin box beneath what would have been the floor of Eleanor's bedroom. Inside was a simple ivory hairbrush with several strands of hair still caught in the bristles, a faded ribbon, and a folded piece of paper. The note, in Eleanor's handwriting, read simply, "Remember who you are." Whether this was a message to herself during her confinement or placed there later as a symbolic reclamation remains unknown. The items were donated to the Virginia Historical Society, where they reside today, small personal counterpoints to the legal and financial documents that defined her father's perspective on her value. Dr. Sandra Mercer, in her 2018 psychological analysis of the case, observes, Eleanor Thornfield's response to trauma represents a remarkable example of post-traumatic growth. Rather than being defined by what was done to her, she constructed an identity and purpose in direct opposition to her experience. Her educational philosophy, with its emphasis on women's financial and legal self-determination, represents not just recovery, but transformation of personal trauma into social intervention. In modern terms, we might call this survivor advocacy, using one's own experience to prevent similar harm to others. Today, scholars continue to study the Thornfield case as a uniquely well-documented example of the intersection between patriarchal authority, economic desperation, and the legal framework that facilitated both. The papers remain accessible at the Virginia Historical Society, though researchers report they still provoke strong emotional responses. As historian James Blackwood noted in 2020, reading these documents feels like witnessing a slow-motion tragedy where every participant except Eleanor is following a terrible logic to its conclusion. Edmund Thornfield wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was simply a man fully embodying the values of his time and place, taken to their logical extreme. That's what makes this case so disturbing. It reveals not individual depravity, but systemic moral failure. Perhaps the final word should belong to Eleanor herself, from the conclusion of her letter to Catherine Pembroke. When I teach young women to understand property law and financial instruments, some question the practicality of such knowledge. I tell them that the difference between being a person and being property sometimes rests on nothing more than understanding the language in which ownership is defined and transferred. Father's power lay partly in my ignorance of the very instruments he used to barter me away. I ensure my students will never face such disadvantage. Knowledge may not guarantee freedom, but ignorance almost certainly guarantees its absence. This is my legacy, fashioned from what nearly destroyed me. For visitors to Richmond today who know the story, the James River still flows past where Thornwood once stood, carrying its secrets downstream, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, merely submerged beneath the surface of the present, its currents still shaping the landscape we navigate today.